actually, first off, I'm Helen Jensen. I'm the Research Program Manager for the Bauta Initiative on Canadian Seed Security. I'll be hosting a webinar today, and it's called How to Breed and Register Your Own Potato Variety, ou comment sélectionner et enregistrer votre propre variété de pommes de terre.
How to breed and register your own potato variety.
Is a note on language interpretation, ou l'interprétation. So attendees, we do offer this webinar with a simultaneous translation, so you can listen in the language of your choice. You can select the audio channel to hear the translated audio in English or in French. Alors, nous offrons ce webinaire avec une traduction simultanée. Alors, vous pouvez choisir le canal.
So you can choose the channel you wish for your interpretation needs, whether it's English or French, presumably English in this case. And if you can hear the interpreter's voice, not Helen's at this time, or Helen's in background, that means you found the interpretation function, so you will hear the interpretation throughout the meeting.
And as we get started, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral, sorry, yes? Oh, I thought I heard a question. We want to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all the Indigenous people that call this land home. And I would maybe add, for me, in the context of the work I do in research with plants and with farmers and on living systems, I really mean to pursue a strong commitment to ethics in the research that we engage in. And in particular, I aim to build work that recognizes and places value on the intellectual contribution to creatorship of all individuals and groups. And furthermore, to proceeding with a lot of caution and respect for the living ecosystems in which this work is done. Also, this is still like just some webinar housekeeping on cultivating a safer space for everyone to engage and contribute. We want this to be a supportive and non-threatening environment for all. We hope presenters will feel valued and respected and may freely choose not to answer a question. We hope that all participants will feel comfortable asking questions and learning together. We encourage people to move up and move up. And this is referring to that if you're someone who tends to speak a lot, you can move up into a role of listening more. And if you're a person who tends to speak less, you can move up into a role of speaking more, making sure that everyone has an equal voice. And when we speak, we try to speak from our own experience, or I should try to speak from my own experience. We each should. And so speaking from the I, and then defining to whom we're referring when we use the term we. And if you need any support during this event, please reach out to one of our staff who's in the call right now. How to engage. You can have your video on or off, depending on your preference. And please update your display name to reflect your actual name. And you can add your gender pronouns if you choose. I'd ask everyone now to introduce yourself. Introduce yourself in the chat, just your name, where you're from, and if you want, just a little bit about like your work with potatoes, like why you're joining today. For asking questions, you can use the chat, or when it's the time for actual question period, you can unmute yourself. And if you choose, start your video and ask the question live. In the context of this webinar, we are going to hold the actual like Q&A part of the discussion until after all three presenters have spoken, because the three talks do go together and some questions may be answered in another presentation. So if everyone is okay, we will start the actual content. So we have three speakers today. So I'm the first one, and I will be providing a review of the PPB potato programs that the Bauta Initiative has implemented in collaboration with different partners from 2013 through 2021. And our follow-up speakers will be Dwayne Falk, who is affiliated with the University of Guelph and has done a lot of the actual crosses for the potato program. And the final speaker is Ceallaigh-Bisson, who is our policy analyst, and he'll be talking more about registration options for PPB potato varieties. So moving into just the review of our programs. These have been going on for a while. They kind of overlap with each other, but they're all a bit different. And I think it's important for me to be able to outline them and give you a bit of an update on where everything is. Going back just a little bit, why are we doing participatory plant breeding, or what we abbreviate as PPB with potatoes? It's basically that participatory breeding works as a method to develop varieties that are adapted to specific needs that farmers have pretty much anywhere in the world. There was a review done in 2019 by Ceccarelli and Grando that looked at and found there were currently about 254 PPB projects in 69 countries. And this includes like a very active program in the Netherlands for potato. There's also programs in Canada around oats and wheat, and many others. So I've just put out a few of like barley adapted to mountain growing conditions in Morocco, in Honduras, a lot of work with beans adapted to specific ecosystems. And so basically, if we're using PPB as a breeding approach, it's because it allows farmers to set their priorities, and it's effective. So we've actually had 3 separate PPB programs in the context of the Bauta Family Initiative work. And the first program was from 2013 to 2016, and it was led by the University of Manitoba in collaboration with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and the Bauta Family Initiative. From 2016 to 2018, there was another program that was also collaboration with the University of Manitoba and the Bauta Family Initiative. And there's a new program that's ongoing now, which is led by the Bauta Family Initiative in collaboration with the Consortium de Recherche sur la Pomme de Terre du Québec, which is a Quebec research potato breeding institution, and Bishop's University. So really, I'm just going to go through these programs one at a time, because knowing which of these programs you're in and what you've selected from it, it sort of informs what you can do next, what's been done and what you can do next. So this first program that started in 2013 was very much a tight collaboration with a breeder at Agriculture Canada named Benoit Bizimangu. Some of you may have met him earlier on in the program. And so in this program, like the actual crosses happened before the program started. They were made at Agriculture Canada in 2011. And when the Bauta Initiative actually started as a program, we recruited like 6 farmers to do this, to engage in this PPB program. And the farmers chose which crosses to grow. They didn't have the opportunity to actually say like which parents they wanted crossed, but they were able to choose out of a list of crosses which ones were more appropriate to their needs, including color, disease resistance, just different traits that were interesting to them. And these farmers did 3 years of on-farm selection. So they took these initial tubers. They would have like either 500 to 1,000 tubers per farm. They'd plant them out. In the first year, they kept about 20% of the best one according to their criteria for a good potato. And this really depended on the farmer, what a good potato was, but generally people wanted it to taste good. They wanted good yield. They wanted it to have kind of a robust growth habit, so it was easy to cultivate around it, and it was suppressive of weeds. And then in subsequent years, they would grow out like slightly larger amounts of each of the sort of better varieties that they picked until they ended up with a fairly small number of selections. And depending on the farmer, this was anywhere from like 1 to like 10, potential varieties. And these were evaluated in what we call common gardens, or just basically a replicated research plot where all the potatoes from all these different farms are grown in one place, each variety is like present like 3 to 4 times in the plot. And then the researchers are able to measure yield and just a number of traits related to the potatoes. And so this was done in different places, either in Manitoba or in Fredericton or in Quebec, in 2015 through 2017. And reports of these evaluations are available on the seedsecurity.ca website for those who would like to look into them in more detail. And so that's kind of starting in 2015, these evaluations started. From 2016 on, farmers were able to continue testing their varieties on farm if they wanted to. They did need to sign kind of an extension of their agreement with Agriculture Canada for this. Like this potato project, like it does come with more paperwork and intellectual property restrictions because of the partnership with Agriculture Canada. It's just a very formal system. And also starting in 2016, farmers had the option to register, license, and commercialize their material if they wanted to do an actual like commercial certified seed production of the material. But unfortunately, this was fairly costly option, and most of the farmers we worked with aren't originally seed potato producers. So mostly they opted to either continue testing or to continue having their potatoes in the common garden trials. And so moving forward, in 2019 through 2021, we had a second round of funding to trial these potatoes and others at Agriculture Canada in Fredericton. And so a plot was set up in 2019 and gave some preliminary results. In 2020, as we all know, COVID-19 came along and we weren't able to do the plot, but AFC sort of kept some of the selections going in the greenhouse just to keep them alive. And in 2021, we were able to do another plot again. And so that's ongoing. And during this time, with the aim to kind of keep this germplasm that's been selected by farmers alive, we worked with AFC, we worked with, a number of people who are stakeholders in this and read through the old reports and prioritized a number of selections to move into tissue culture. And tissue culture really just means it's like a clean way of keeping the germplasm alive. And it's also just a safe way of backing it up in case like something happens to the farmer's tuber collection, they're mixed up at harvest, or there's a disease or just something happens. Like this is a way of protecting all of that work. And some farmer, and then from there, the goal is really to use this tissue culture to produce clean seed. That means seed potato that doesn't have viruses or fungal contaminants, and that this clean seed can be made available, to the farmers if they wish to, license them, or to seed potato producers who might want to license them and might be able to offer these varieties on the market so that potato producers could access them, these organic adapted varieties. So that was like the first iteration of the potato program. I've got a few photos from it here just to show just some of especially here on the top right, this is kind of in 1,000 tubers. This is a farmer who planted 1,000 mini tubers and harvested them all and then really selected them, which ones looked best in the field, stored them, and then in the spring kind of threw out all the ones that didn't store well and kind of worked their way down to, 6 varieties that they thought were good. So these are just some various images of that. And you can see that some of these varieties really produce a striking number of tubers per plant. So this photo on the bottom of these red potatoes, that's one plant's worth of tubers, which is quite impressive. And this is what some of these trial lots look like. It's just setting up just a fairly uniform, standardized plot. And here are just some more pictures of some of the nice potatoes. And some of the results we found is that some of the farmer selections really were less appetizing to the Colorado potato beetle. And so all these photos I'm showing here were taken on the same date in the same plot. And you can see that really the insects ate some of them right down to the stems and left some of them more or less alone. And this was just interesting to observe. And also definitely the ones that were a bit less palatable to the potato beetles were from fields that I know had seen quite important pest pressure. So like the selection environment was quite good for this. And I'd made just a bit of a scale to represent it. So on the left, you have like producers' selections. So all these varieties that are just identified by some letters and numbers are owned by the producer or were selected by the producers. And there's a scale of Colorado potato beetle damage from like 1 being not much damage all the way to 9 being very severely damaged. And we can see that the producer varieties mostly were like a 1 or a 3 in terms of damage, like not much damage. And if you compare it to the reference varieties that we had, which are just, standard varieties that you can buy commercially, the reference varieties really ranged in insect damage quite a bit. So there was Kennebec, which was actually quite unappetizing to the potato beetle, and all the way up to varieties like Yukon Gold and Envol and Agria that had like quite severe damage, or a 7 level of damage. So we found like it seemed that just generally the producer varieties, like they just, after a certain level of insect damage, the producers just didn't select them at all. And we also found that the yellow varieties the producers selected tended to be like more tolerant of the Colorado potato beetle than the commercial yellow varieties. So that was really interesting to see. And if any of you really want to dig through the full results about these evaluations, there's a really good report that's available on our website, but also on AgriRéseau, which is a Quebec site for sharing agricultural reports. And there you have like some good scales around just how each variety did with regards to a number of different traits. And I will let you consult that independently at a future time, because I want to talk about the next iteration of the breeding program, which was moving towards having a less restrictive intellectual property on the potatoes to allow farmers a bit more freedom around what they want to do with the potatoes. And this started in 2016 to 2018. And this is where we directly funded Dwayne Falk, who will be talking after me, who's retired from the University of Guelph and has a lifetime of breeding experience. He was hired to make potato crosses, and he assembled these in more diverse sets. And these were made available to participating farms. And from the very beginning, like these potato sets, like they were sort of paid for, independently, with the goal that when they're given to the farmers own them. Like there's no intellectual property attached to them beforehand. And the model of selection was fairly similar to what I described before, which is that farmers select for 3 years on farm and slowly narrow down from like a few hundred possible potato varieties to maybe, between 1 and 5 potato varieties that they think are good that they might want to keep working with. And these varieties went into that same common garden trial at Fredericton that I told you about from 2019 to 2021, and faced the same obstacles around COVID as well. But everyone had a chance to resubmit potatoes this year, and the trial is ongoing this year. And it's also been very important in this that farmers continue to grow the potatoes on their farm and evaluate them according to their own farm standards. In the spring and fall of 2021, everyone in this cohort was offered the chance to have their potatoes tested for glycoalkaloids, which I'll get into a bit later. And then now we've come to this exciting point where we have this options guide for registration that my colleague Christy will present. And the future plan, these dotted lines indicate, this hasn't happened yet, but I'm working on it, or we're working on it, is to also move these varieties into tissue culture to create just a gene bank and a backup of this material, and to really facilitate the process for the growers to be able to move these potatoes forward in the way that works best for you. That can include registration. A little update, because I know some of you do have potatoes in this site at Fredericton in 2021. So I just want to give you a bit of an update on how it's going. And the goal is really to get data on the potato selections submitted by producers using a replicated design, which is, as I mentioned before, where each variety appears more than once in the plot, and that's to just compensate for any unevenness in the plot conditions. They were planted quite late on June 18th because the fields were very wet. So that affected, that may have affected the results somewhat. The tubers, when they arrived from the farms, were in varying condition. Some were well preserved, but some were a bit dehydrated, and there was also some rot. And that's really just due to the fact that it's difficult to ship tubers in the spring, like they're coming out of dormancy. And if there's any delays in the postal service or in the pickup or the storage, this is just something to be aware of, that not all the tubers were at their very best when they were put in here. There were Czech varieties, the references, including Yukon Gold, as like a really standard yellow one, Kennebec, which we've observed in many trials, just does very well in organic on a lot of metrics. So we like to put that one in there. Adirondack Blue and Norland. It was an organically managed plot. So they used a trench lined with black plastic to control the Colorado potato beetle, and I assume some student labor to manually control it as well. And fertilization was with an organic lawn fertilizer. So basically, the principles of, the practices of organic agriculture were followed in this plot, even though it's not technically a certified organic plot. And this is the general layout of the field. So there's kind of what's called a guard row around the edge to like buffer against any just effects due to plants being at the outside of it. And then there are like basically 4 blocks where each variety comes back once. And AAFC should be producing like a nice like written report with statistics on this this winter. In the meantime, like I've got just a really preliminary chart of the yield of the varieties. So these first 2 varieties on the left called 1.4 and 12.7, those are actually from the initial selections, like the 2013 to 2016 lot. And then you've got a few controls in here, like Adirondack Blue, Norland, Yukon Gold, and Kennebec. And the rest are all various selections that producers submitted for trialing here. And, these are preliminary results, but you can definitely see that the varieties that come from producers in terms of yields are generally doing like at least as well as the Czechs, and in some cases seem to be doing better. And there's this one variety here that isn't doing as well in terms of yields. This is one where the tubers were quite damaged in transit. So I think if we gave this one another year, it would probably do a lot better in the second year, starting from good, clean tubers. I also want to just highlight that, everyone is still growing their potatoes on farm. And this is just so important, partly because this is the way you actually keep your potato variety alive. And it really gives a good understanding of the performance of the tubers in the conditions they were selected under, and like in the actual conditions that are relevant to a farmer, which is on their own farm. I tried to provide a small amount of support this year. I distributed some certified potato seed of a few reference varieties so that people could plant these next to their potato plot if they just wanted to get at least like something to compare them with. And I also made a data sheet that people could use for various traits. I don't know if anyone did use this, but it is available if there are certain traits you just want some help on how to maybe rate them on a scale and that type of thing. And I think that's on our website, but if not, you can definitely contact me if it's something you'd like for next year. And another thing which I mentioned earlier are glycoalkaloids in potato selections. So glycoalkaloids are naturally occurring secondary metabolites that are in all potato varieties. And they're generally present mostly in the leaves and stems, and they help protect the plant against herbivory they're toxic to most insects, and also protection against fungal infection as well. They're also toxic to humans at high enough concentrations. They are very effective toxins. And in some cases, there can be enough glycoalkaloids in tubers to hit that kind of toxic thresholds for humans. The concentration in tubers can vary based on the genetics, but also growing conditions, storage conditions, and light exposure. And the question then is like how to know if glycoalkaloid levels in a potato that you've selected yourself on your farm are too high. There are some indirect indicators, but these are not accepted by regulators, but they're still helpful to know, which is if the sun looks a bit greened or sunburned, that might be an indicator of higher glycoalkaloids. And also if there's a bitter taste, also possibly an indicator. So definitely as soon as you see or perceive either of those, you probably don't want to keep eating that potato. But if you really want to know and you want to feel confident in eating this or sharing it with someone, there's a formal laboratory test which uses high performance liquid chromatography. And basically this test will determine if your potatoes have less than 20 milligrams of total glycoalkaloids per 100 grams of fresh weight of tuber. And so anything that are below that is considered safe, and anything above that is considered not to be consumed. And so this testing was offered to producers by the Bauta Initiative in spring of 2021. So some of you will have sent your potatoes in then for testing. And I've also recently done another round of sampling for the fall. So there should be a round of new results coming in as well. Here are the results from the spring. So basically each sample or échantillon here is tested for 2 glycoalkaloids, solanin and chaconin. And the concentrations of each of those are added up to a total. And basically this total number should be less than 20. And so most of them are well under 20, and a few are kind of close or slightly over. So those are ones we definitely want to test again to be sure. And to know these were tested in the spring when we would, after storage, when we would expect glycoalkaloids to be a lot higher than in the fall. So this round of testing in the fall should be very informative for everyone. And lastly, I just want to give you just a small preview of the new PPV potato project we have, which is in Quebec only at this time. And it's selection for organic adapted varieties, but we're adding in the use of molecular markers for late blight resistance. And this is like a 2020 through 2023 project. And it's on 2 institutional sites in Quebec and 5 farm sites starting. The 5 farm sites will be starting next year. And so the reason for this, here I just have some numbers around crop area of organic potatoes in Quebec. And you can just see it's really something that's growing quite fast. So in 2014, you had about 20 hectares of organic potatoes in the whole province. And in 2020, we're up to like about 130 hectares. So you can really see that there's, it's a growing market and there is interest for varieties that work well in organic conditions. And there's the problem that a lot of people raise around growing organic potatoes, or like shifting from conventional to organic production, is the yield. And so typically organic production of potatoes has about 50 to 65% of the yield of conventional. And that's quite a big drop. And it has been found, though, that under ideal conditions with no late blight, you can get about 82% of the yield in organic that you would get in conventional. And most of the variation in this yield is due, like 48% of it is due to the availability and use of nitrogen. And 25% of it is due to mildew, which is late blight. So the goal of this project is really to do both selection in organic conditions and really working on plants that use nitrogen efficiently, and also to use some molecular markers to really be selecting varieties that will be resistant to late blight. And we hope with this we can have potatoes people like, and that also maybe slightly buffered against these yield decreases and yield variations that are observed in organic. There was a consultation with producers that was done for this. I'm going to just go through this a bit fast because I want to leave time for the other presenters. But basically, producers felt that like organic varieties are really key to a transition towards a more ecological potato production province-wide. And also pointed out that there are many resistant varieties, but generally they're not palatable or they don't look nice. So there's just some work around like moving them forward a little bit. And that generally like just varieties that are resistant to disease and well received would really be a game changer for organic potato. And this study is in partnership with some new partners coming in here. So Bishop's University in Quebec, the Consortium de Recherche sur la Pomme de Terre du Québec, and then Farm Sites and the Bauta Family Initiative for Canadian State Security, as well as the CETAB Plus in Victoriaville, which will be doing more of an economic analysis of the costs around participatory breeding and valuation of the contributions of different stakeholders. And, you know, I'm going to just skip through these because I think it's time to move on to the next presenter, which will be Dwayne Falk. And you're welcome to ask me further questions or ask all of us further questions later during the Q&A part. So I will stop sharing my screen and I'll pass it over to you, Dwayne.
Okay, I think I'm on. Is everything working?
I don't think we can see your screen yet, Dwayne.
Okay. I'll pull it up. Well, my fingers aren't working quite the way they're supposed to right now. Okay, I think we're there. In presentation mode. Okay, what I wanted to talk about is the breeding that goes into developing a new potato variety. And this is basically what happened before the farmers got their potatoes. So I'm going to go through it fairly quickly, but it gives you an idea of just what's involved in developing a new variety of potatoes for organic production. Okay, as you can see, there's a lot of diversity in potatoes, but in most breeding programs, most of that diversity really is not desirable. This little guy that looks like a pine cone here, I don't think most people would want to try to peel that and then put it on their table. So a lot of the diversity is there, but is not necessarily usable. We're looking for something that produces variation, that is usable, that helps organic producers. So the objective of what I was doing was to generate new genetic variation. I was going to grow the seedlings to get mini tubers and then grow the mini tubers to get true tubers. Now, the original project with AAFC, they distributed mini tubers to farmers. And mini tubers are the size of marbles, and they do not compete very well with weeds. And I felt that it was almost unfair to the potatoes to put them in an organic situation where there would be a lot of weed competition. So I grew them one extra generation. The mini tubers grow to produce true tubers, which are regular potatoes. And that's what we distributed to the farmers through my part of the project. Basically, I was the breeder distributing things to organic farmers. We distributed 2 true tubers to the farmers. They then evaluated them and made their selections. And then we had feedback so that what they got, they picked out what they liked. Ideally, that would come back to the breeder. The breeder would then intercross those materials selected by organic farmers on organic conditions and develop new varieties that were even better suited for organic producers. So when you want to get new genetic variation in potatoes, you actually have to make a cross. You have to produce something called true potato seed, which is what's also known as TPS. This is done by making specific crosses among varieties where you actually take pollen from one flower, put it on the stigma of another, get the seed, and then grow those seeds. Potato seed looks a lot like tomato seed, by the way. They're quite closely related, and the seed is handled in much the same way. There are two ways of generating new variability. One is by making specific crosses among varieties. The other way is by using open pollinated seed from the field or from some other situation. Potatoes are really complex genetically. And so when you make a cross, it's very difficult to predict what the progeny are going to have. And so in many cases, just knowing the female is just as good as knowing both the male and the female. And when you don't know the male, the bumblebees bring in pollen from all over the field, and you actually can get more genetic variation, and you get some interesting surprises. So here on the right is a plant with seed on it. The first group of mini tubers was produced from an actual cross of two different varieties. The second group was produced from a female selected in the field, and you see that there's a lot more variation in that second group. So we knew the female, had some idea of what to expect from it, but did not know the male parent. So most of the seed that I distributed was developed in that way. Some was from specific crosses, but most from open pollination. As we know, most potatoes produce flowers. Some of them are very pretty. Some of them even smell nice. They produce seed. Like I say, some of them produce seed like tomatoes. And that will be genetically variable if it's gone through the sexual process. If you harvest what are known as seed potatoes, they're basically a clone. Okay. I'm not sure when to click and when not to on this. And those represent the phenotype of the parent, but do not represent new genetic variability. They should reproduce exactly until some sort of mutation occurs within them, which is a very, very slow evolutionary process. The true potato seed produced through sexual recombination gives tremendous genetic diversity. And that's what we're trying to work with. So if you go in any potato field, you can probably find a few seed balls. In some varieties, they produce a lot of them. Other varieties produce very few of them, but they are out there if you start looking for them. So what we did is harvested the fruit of the tomato, let it ripen up until they were a little bit softer, put them into a magic bullet blender, blended them up, and the seed is quite tough. So the balls break up and you get what looks kind of like a lumpy smoothie. This is it right after blending. If you let it sit for 3 or 4 days, you get some fermentation. And that fermentation is usually on the seed ball, and it sort of cleans off the seed. And it's almost exactly the same process with tomatoes. You want to let them ferment a little bit before you harvest them for seed. Once it's fermented, then you add water, rinse it. Most of the fermented seed ball material rises to the top, and the seed itself actually sinks to the bottom. They're heavier, they're denser. You pour that off, rinse it 2 or 3 times, run it through a coffee filter, and then pull the filter out and dry them. And that is your true potato seed. That is where genetic variability comes from. So it's just a sequential step, and it takes several days to go through the whole process. But then you've got dry seed that you can store for up to 10 years, just like tomato seed. If you take that seed and plant it, and here I've planted several rows, all from one cross, cover them lightly with soil. They germinate and produce what looks like a small potato leaf tomato. In the flats, they're grown fairly closely. I pulled out the most vigorous ones and transplanted them to pots. And here you can see a little tiny true potato. There's a dime to give you an idea of the size of those leaves. It already has a tuber on it. Potatoes were meant to produce tubers. That's what they like to do. That's what they do very, very well. So it's got basically 2 true leaves and already forming a tuber. So once they're transplanted, we grew them up in individual pots. When they reached maturity, which was around 2 to 3 months after planting. We dried them down and then basically harvested on an individual pot basis. So each one of these pots was a different plant. The tubers underneath it are all genetically identical because they are from a single plant. They're genetically different from every other set in this whole series. So this is all from one cross. There's a blue one, some white ones, some red ones, some pink ones, some that are probably not going to go too far. Others look quite good. We then planted them in the field. Now, this is what was distributed to farmers initially, and those are 2-inch pots. So you see how tiny these are. They're truly mini tubers. I prepared the field with my potato planter to dig the trenches and then planted them by hand. Each section was planted about 8 to 10 inches apart from others. So this was a whole field of small plants coming from mini tubers. And here they are growing a little while later, and they're all individually spaced. You can see some of them did not grow at all. Some of them germinated very late. Some of them germinated very early and were quite vigorous. All of these are from mini tubers. Some of them were bigger tubers than others. Each row or between each set of stakes is a different cross. So people came out to inspect them to make sure we were actually growing them. This is what the field looked like the middle of July. You can see there are plants growing, not all of them again. A few weeds. The end of July, a few more weeds. Somebody got the rototiller out, and the next day it looked like this. So some of them were very vigorous plants, doing quite well, but the best of them still only reached about 1/3 of the size of a normal potato plant. So middle of August, this is what the plots looked like. First part of October, they were pretty well mature, so we harvested them. Each plant went into a separate bag. Each one was dug separately and then put into a separate bag. So this was the main harvest. By the next day, they were all up. Those from a single cross were put into a single large bag, so they were all put in together. But within that were these small bags, each from a single plant. And the next day, the only thing left in the field was this one row of a very late variety from Peru. So this is what happened when they were dug. Each plant came up separately. These were the tubers from each plant. You can see individual hills here from different crosses. Here I've outlined 3 different rows. This first one was from Adirondack Blue as a female. And you can see some of them were really good, others not so good at all. But Adirondack Blue produced red potatoes, blue potatoes, pink potatoes, and white potatoes. So that gives you some idea of the genetic variability. This middle row is from Yukon Gold. And when it outcrossed, obviously some of the pollen came from a red plant. And the bottom one was from Ruby Gold, which is another red variety related to Yukon Gold. And again, some red ones, some white ones. And this one here, you know, you got to draw the line someplace. Some of them, the plant that I harvested produced a mini tuber that was smaller than the tuber that I planted. They didn't go too far, but some of the rest of them looked really nice. So what we did then is keep each plant separately. We cleaned them up, took them inside. By the way, this was that Peruvian variety at the end. That's all it produced. It looked great, but it certainly was not well adapted. We then distributed one tuber from each of those plants to each of 2 or 3 different farmers. So they each got an array of the material produced by those mini tubers, but they got a true tuber. They got a real potato. They could plant that. It would be much more competitive with weeds. And they were off to the races to see how well it would do under their conditions and then make their selections. Now, as we know, Colorado potato beetle is one of the real enemies, but there is genetic resistance to it. We had some varieties that survived, some that thrived, and others were basically sticks under a fairly heavy infestation with Colorado potato beetle. We also know that late blight is one of the big problems. We also know there's genetic resistance to it. This is one set of plots. This is one variety. variety Estima, by the way. This is Chieftain, and this was the segregating population. They all looked like this about a week before that. We had 3 days of a warm, wet rain. Temperatures were in the low 20s, and late blight came in and just destroyed them, except for Estima. And this is a selection of Estima that came from an organic farmer. So organic farmers are pretty good at selecting for resistance. This population, I have then gone into and selected some resistance out of it myself. But Estima must have pretty good resistance to begin with, and there's maybe a little bit of variation that can be improved in there. So Estima is a good place to start for resistance to late blight. We also know that scab is a problem. My farm has a pH of about 7.2 to 7.4. If the pH was 5, we'd probably never see scab. But under higher pH, scab is a problem. And it's one of the biggest problems I have. However, there is genetic resistance. Most russet potatoes are inherently resistant to scab, and some other regular potatoes are as well. So the resistance does exist. It can be selected for, and it is stable from one year to the next. So there are ways of getting at most of the problems that we have. So if you're going to breed potatoes, you start with good parents. So right now, there are probably some of the newer commercial varieties that make good parents based on disease resistance, agronomics, and quality. Some of the newer organic selections and some of the European organic selections, I think, would also be worth including in a breeding program, partly because they have better adaptation to organic systems. Selection is a big part of it. Once you've made the crosses, then you have to go out there and select. And if you select under organic conditions, you should have something that performs better under those conditions. But you do need multiple sites, multiple years, multiple farmers, multiple stresses to get the big picture of what a variety is really capable of doing. And then it has to be evaluated in replicated trials, as we've done with the organic trials and with AFC. So that's it in a nutshell. The hard work is being done by the farmers. I'm just supplying them with some of the material to make progress with. So I'm going to stop sharing now and go back to Helen, I believe.
Thanks, Dwayne. I think we'll actually let Christy queue up his slides now. So he'll be presenting about the options guide for variety registration that he's put together.
Hello, everyone. Is everyone able to see my slides all right? Good. All right. Hello, everyone, and thanks again for joining us today for today's presentation on the development and use of the PPB material with which you have been working. My name is Críostaigh. My pronouns are they and him, and I am a policy analyst with Sea Change, and I will be explaining the regulatory and economic considerations that may figure into what you decide to do with the PPB material. So first, I would like to just mention that I am located in Mi'kma'ki in so-called Lunenburg County, Nova Scotia, on the unceded and unsurrounded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, with whom I'm in a treaty relationship through the 1726 Treaty of Peace and Friendship. And I mentioned this to share my intention to work towards decolonization of our seed system and collaboration to realize a just and sustainable alternative. In my presentation, I will be sharing insights on 5 topics, after which we will have time for discussions. So first, I will talk about how the PPB material from this program fits into the formal Canadian seed and food system. Second, I will briefly cover various options and considerations around direct distribution of the PPB potato material as food. Third, I will explain the garden variety seed potato listing option that growers can pursue to distribute relatively small quantities of seed potatoes. Fourth, I will discuss the process of variety registration for new seed potato varieties, which allows growers to distribute seed potato in unrestricted quantities. And finally, I will go over the seed potato certification process, which the CFIA requires for the distribution of seed potatoes in Canada. And after this presentation, we will have time for questions and discussions about all the information we covered today. So our intention for this presentation is to give you a better understanding of what options are available for PPB potatoes, direct distribution opportunities, what the garden variety seed potato listing process involves, the variety registration, what variety registration involves, and how, and we would love to hear any feedback on how farmers could best be supported to register a variety or have it listed as a garden variety. So just please note that all the information that I will be presenting on today is available in the Participatory Plant Breeding for Potatoes in Canada guide that was circulated for today's presentation. And before we dig in, I would also like to know a little more about where folks are at in terms of their familiarity on the subject. For this, we have prepared a brief poll, which should be available in the chat just momentarily. All right, so I thank you for all who filled that out. So now I'd like to go over some key terms that I will be using a lot in today's presentation. The first concept I will be using a lot is variety listing or listed variety. Listed varieties are any potato variety that has been included in the CFIA's official garden variety seed potato list. The action of listing or describe or the description of a listed variety is a new term that we have been using because there's few resources available that describe the complete role and usage of the ministerial directive that created the list. So just be mindful that this is not a conventional industry term that is commonly used. The second concept, registered variety, is a potato variety that has successfully been through the CFIA's variety registration process. And the final concept is certified seed potato, which is potatoes of a listed or registered variety that has been inspected twice in one season by the CFIA and granted a crop certificate with an official seed potato grain on it. So these three concepts are easy to get mixed up. Seed potatoes get listed, registered, and certified, and they seem like synonymous to one another. But in fact, they're very different things that kind of fit together in a process that is detailed in the following chart. So to give a bird's eye view of the different pathways, here's a map to help us get where we want to go. Farmers in this program have been struggling with the question of how to distribute their PPB potatoes because it's both unlisted and unregistered material. This means that it is not permitted within the seed regulations to be distributed as seed potatoes. And most provinces have quantity restrictions on how much unlisted or unregistered potatoes can be distributed as food. As a result, there are really two pathways that this guide discusses. One for registered and unlisted varieties in small quantities through direct distribution, and one that involves seed potato certification. So many farmers who have been working with the PPB potatoes have already explored direct channels of distribution of potatoes as food. And some of these common strategies include farm stands, farmers markets, community supported agriculture, small scale processors, small scale distribution, mutual aid and solidarity networks, and restaurants. And I'm sure we could sit and brainstorm even more options of direct distribution. What is important to understand here, though, is that food potato production in Canada is heavily determined by provincial regulations. And also provincial laws around potato production and distribution differ significantly from one another. This means that it's best to understand what the specific local laws and regulations are in your province. All provinces except for British Columbia have an area of production threshold, which determines if you are required to either register with or seek a license from a provincial potato marketing authority. These are organizations granted authority by the province to authorize production of table stock and processing potatoes if you're producing more than the legal amount detailed in the provincial regulations. And all of these authorities require that members and licensees use certified potatoes, which means indirectly that the PPB potatoes need to either be listed or registered to be grown in quantities larger than the threshold. Of course, this restriction does not apply to the production of direct private consumption. Several provinces, including BC, Quebec, and Saskatchewan, also have special seed potato protection zones. And these zones are areas where it is prohibited to bring in potato that are not produced and certified in that region. And these regions, these regulations are they're meant to protect commercially significant seed potato producers from potential risks of crop pests. In BC, this is the Pemberton Valley. In Quebec, there are several municipalities in the Ceallaigh-Bisson area, the Côte-Nord, and the Bas-Saint-Laurent. And these are considered seed potato protection zones. And Saskatchewan is unique in that it is prohibited throughout the entire province to bring any unauthorized seed potato, which has an interesting history that I'm happy to share if there are any questions during the question period event. What these protection zones mean for the PPB material is that farmers need to talk to local authorities to understand what the process is, if any, to bring the PPB potatoes into their region. Now that we have discussed direct distribution options available to farmers engaged in the PPB program, we will now turn our attention to options that require engagement with federal seed regulations. But to first clarify our position, the way we at Seed Change understand our seed system is that Indigenous people and farmers are the original plant breeders who were regulated by a community-based ethos of stewardship, rather than a national regulatory apparatus. Yet the crop diversity all people benefit from today is a result of their seed stewardship and their deep knowledge of their land and food. While many farmers all over the world continue to adapt and develop varieties for their own farms, plant breeding has become increasingly institutionalized, and seed distribution has become specialized through market-based production over the past century. This means that most farmers are no longer engaged in the process of plant breeding. In Canada, in order for many agricultural crops, including potatoes grown for seed or for commercial distribution in large quantities, they must be listed or registered. Successfully registering a variety involves undergoing a public process of registration to ensure that said variety is safe and reliable for growers and consumers to use. These regulations are in place because of the market structure of potato distribution in Canada, which requires public measures to prevent fraud, protect the public interest, and preserve the quality of seed potatoes in Canada. And we feel that this process can be relatively lengthy and costly for farmers. However, we think that given the exploitative nature of capitalist agriculture in Canada, it is important to have these regulations, and that in some cooperation between program partners, we can get PPB material registered, allowing farmers to distribute it through the formal seed system. Ultimately, I bring this up this contradiction between the need for regulatory protection from market exploitation and the capacity challenges faced by farmers to invite us to think creatively beyond the present structure of agricultural development and imagine a just and sustainable alternative that can bring about food sovereignty starting with our seed system. However, I don't think we can prescribe alternatives without first understanding the present system with which we must engage. So seed potato production in Canada is governed through the Seeds Regulations, Part 2. Not all horticultural crops require variety registration to distribute a new variety of seed. In fact, the Seeds Regulations contain a tiered framework of regulations that apply certain provisions to certain crop types. In the Seeds Regulations, potatoes are specifically included as commercial potatoes, which is meant to include the production of large quantities of potatoes into the formal potato system. However, this term can be misleading. Therefore, instead, we refer to these potatoes as registered potatoes, because practically speaking, variety registration is the appropriate pathway for the distribution at this scale. So registered potatoes are placed in Schedule 3, Part 3 of the Seeds Regulations. This placement creates a regulatory distinction between listed and registered seed potato production. The CFIA has defined the difference between these two categories through a ministerial directive as follows. Registered seed potatoes are produced in fields that are larger than 1.5 hectares. And listed seed potatoes are produced in fields that are equal to or smaller than 1.5 hectares. And this ministerial directive, along with various provincial regulations, also require listed seed potatoes to be certified through the procedures detailed in the seed regulations. As you can see in this table, the categorization of commercial, or as we shall call it, registered seed potatoes, in the Part 3 category of Schedule 3 means that variety registration does not require the suite of registration procedures required for many grain crops. I will be going over what's specifically required for potato variety registration in a moment, but first you may notice that there is no regulatory placement for non-commercial, or as we call it, listed seed potatoes in the seeds regulation. This is because the procedure for certification of listed seed potatoes is prescribed, once again, through a ministerial directive and not in the seeds regulations. So to satisfy CFIA's desire for small quantities of unique seed potato varieties to be certified without requiring variety registration, they have created something called the Garden Variety Seed Potato List. The CFIA saw that there were seed companies selling seed potatoes at home to home gardens and to market gardeners using small quantities of seed potato from heirloom or unconventional potato stock, and that this still posed a risk for the introduction of plant pests into the seed potato system. The CFIA potato section wanted to make sure that there was a way for unconventional seed potatoes informally in circulation to be eligible for certification despite the challenges for small-scale producers to go through variety registration. The Garden Variety Seed Potato List is therefore a collection of unconventional potato varieties that qualify for seed potato certification. Seed potato varieties can be added to the list if they meet 3 conditions. First, they cannot be more than 1.5 hectares produced per class of the variety by any farm during a single season. This means that a farm can grow several classes of the same variety per season. Farms can also produce up to 1.5 hectare limit of the variety every year. And finally, more than one farm can produce the same classes of the same varieties during the same season. However, one farm cannot produce more than 1.5 hectare of the same class of the same variety during one season. Hope that's clear. Second, the potato variety cannot be a variety that is already registered in Canada. And third, there cannot be any plant breeder rights protections claimed for the variety in Canada, which would apply to, for instance, the AFC varieties of potatoes. Though other requirements are not defined in the ministerial directive, I've been advised that there may be requests for other documentation, which details a variety description, pedigree of the potato, glycoalkaloid test results, and bacterial ring rot test results. Say that 3 times fast. If a farmer participating in the program is interested in expanding the seed potato to produce large-scale quantities, which the CFIA defines as an area larger than 1.5 hectares, then they are required to have the material registered as a new potato variety. Because seed potatoes for large-scale production are listed as a Schedule 3, Part 3 crop, the process of variety registration is relatively straightforward compared to what is required for many grain crops. Registration entails working with a local CFIA inspector responsible for seed potato certification. And they may request that the registrant supply certain agronomic and pest data to be able to certify the seed potato variety. Additional to any such data, an application for variety registration also needs to include a complete registration form, registration fee, an objective description form and pictures of the potato tubers, and finally, a detailed plan of the crops grown on the site and how the seed potato stock will be stored. All of these components are then put together to be submitted to the CFIA Variety Registration Office for the registration of a new seed potato variety. And once the variety is registered, then it can be eligible for seed potato certification, which allows it to be distributed as seed potato. Now, certified seed potatoes are inspected by the CFIA to ensure that it meets the quality standards detailed in the seeds regulations. Initially, a local CFIA office will inspect and supervise a comprehensive sanitation of the seed potato planting and harvesting equipment, as well as the storage facilities. This will allow the site to be authorized as an area where certified seed potatoes can be produced. Farmers are then asked to submit an application for certification on a yearly basis. The field where the seed potato is growing needs to be inspected twice in the season. The standards and the regulations, organize seed potato into 8 classes that correspond to different levels of quality. The ranking of these classes is what's called a flush-through system, where the potatoes harvested from one generation are then demoted by one class for 7 generations until it is no longer suitable to be used as seed potato anymore. And once the seed potato is certified, then farmers can distribute it openly by variety. The variety only needs to go through the listing or registration process once. However, it will need to be certified yearly. The flush-through certification class ranking allows for 7 generations of seed potato to be produced from a line of seed potatoes. In its 7th generation, the seed potato can be given the certification status but can no longer be used as the source stock for further seed potato production. And once a farmer has grown the full 7 generations of seed potatoes, they will then need to source tissue culture that is preserved in a lab from which nuclear or pre-elite stock can be derived for another flush of seed potato production. This implies that a relationship is necessary with an organization that has the capacity for long-term storage of potato tissue culture to have the listed or registered variety in seed potato production for longer than 7 years. So now that I have gone over the process of having the PPB material listed or registered as a variety and then certified as seed potato, I will now compare the administrative costs that you can expect for these 2 pathways. And please note that this cost comparison is not a comprehensive costing of production. For instance, I have not included labor, materials, or external services needed for this process. The Tga test, the glycoalkaloid test, can cost between $185 to $650 per potato tissue sample and is required for both pathways, registered and listed. The same thing is true of bacterial ring rot testing, which can cost $55. However, Seed Change has been covering the cost of these tests. Garden variety listing does not have an application fee, but as you can see, variety registration has a fee of $912.14. Variety registration also has a yearly fee of $104.24 to maintain the registration of the variety. Both listed and registered varieties have the same yearly certification costs, which involves 2 crop inspections from the CFIA, each costing $52.12 and a crop certificate fee of $20.85. Overall, this means that you can expect garden variety pathway to involve a one-time expense of $705 with yearly expenses of $125.09. And these expenses unlock the ability to distribute up to 1.5 hectares of seed potato per year. Variety registration will involve a one-time expense of $1,617.14, with yearly expenses starting at $229.33, which increases by $20.85 per hectare of seed potato produced. And these expenses unlock the ability to distribute an unlimited quantity of seed. Otherwise, those are the different pathways for PPB potato production and a basic estimate of the administrative costs to meet the regulatory requirements for seed potato production. And that concludes my presentation. But before we get into questions and discussion component, I would like to direct your attention to the chat. So earlier, we asked you to indicate your level of awareness about regulations surrounding PPB potato production in the poll. And we would now like to ask you to fill out another brief poll in the chat asking how your level of knowledge has changed after this presentation. Thank you. So now that we've had an opportunity to fill out that poll, take your time, fill it out, read it, we will move to the discussion portion of today's event. But before I turn things over to discussion, however, I would like to inform you again that the details found in this presentation are included in the PPB Potato Pathways Guide that was circulated for this event. You're also more than welcome to contact me if you have any policy questions or anyone on our team. We will be following up with PPB potato farmers over the course of the winter and spring to talk more about how we can best support your work. So please do not hesitate to let us know when we can chat about your work with the PPB potato materials. Now, for the discussion, I have shared some potential questions that we have for you. Has this clarified the listing and registration process for you? Is listing or registration a viable option for you? What kinds of supports would make it possible for farmers to list or register a variety? And how can costs of listing and registration be financed? I'd love to know what you think. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Christy. It's a huge amount of work that has gone into figuring out all these regulations and putting them down concisely in one document. So I really just want to acknowledge like how great of a resource that is, like for everyone who's interested in moving forward with the potato work. So does anyone have any questions? This would be the time to put them into the chat. Oh, I think I see one coming up. So Christy, can I ask you a question, which is, or actually, I don't know if it's a question exactly, but I wanted to point out one thing that you talked about, which is that to register a variety, be it a garden variety or the official registration, it has to be something that's not currently on the market. Is that correct?
I'd have to double check to make sure if that's like an officially a thing, but my understanding is that the restriction is that it doesn't have any intellectual property rights involved. And if it's in circulation in the market, there are possibilities that it could, yeah. But also it can't be a registered variety. So if it's like a conventional variety that's in circulation, that would probably mean it's gone through variety registration, which would preclude it from being able to be listed as a garden variety.
Okay. And I think like another thing that's come up sometimes when I've spoken to the folks at AAFC is that like if someone has developed their own variety and they do want to register it, it's important not to circulate it too widely, because if you want to demonstrate that it's really something new, like if it's something that can be found out there, I think it may be harder to demonstrate that that novelty trait. So just something to keep in mind. Like I don't think that applies to just like sharing it very locally, but just something to keep in mind that like distributing something very widely is sometimes incompatible with registering it later on.
Good to know.
I see a question in the chat. Curious why nutritional density is not a requirement in creating new varieties. For example, the Kennebec has almost zero nutrition to it, but it is disease-free and makes good fries, so it is popular. Anyone want to field this one?
It is noteworthy
I guess
that in the variety registration process, there's no requirement for a recommending committee. So in grains, you would have a process to determine the nutritional benefits of the crop that you're trying to register. And we don't have that in Canada for potatoes. But that does make it easier to register, is the one thing.
Yeah, I might add just generally, like, yeah, I think that's definitely a good point, just around how the variety registration system, based on what it expects, can change how people select. I just, in generally in breeding in, the past decades, mostly people have selected for yield or for specific traits that improve agronomic performance. And it's fairly recently in, kind of formalized breeding that breeders are starting to integrate like flavor and nutrients back into the question. And this isn't talking about like historically breeding as it's been known for the past 12,000 years or so has considered, flavor and all that. But in more recent breeding, it just hasn't been considered as part of commodification. And now it is coming back in, but it's not a requirement yet. It's more something that is starting to be seen as good to do, but it's not required. Does anyone else have any questions or follow-ups or clarifications, comments you want to tell us about your own potato work? So Dwayne has popped up in the chat saying nutritional quality is very environmentally influenced, so it can be difficult to make it a strict requirement. And Chris Wooding, let's see, has a question that I'm going to turn to the group, if that's okay with you, Chris, because I think Christy can answer it better than I, which is, can use be associated with the registration? Which in particular says I have a pink flesh potato that makes spectacular chips, but turns to gruel when boiled. So is there any kind of special use that can be added to the registration, Christy?
To my knowledge, the registration process does not require, there may be something within the variety registration form, I haven't filled it out myself, about intended uses for it, but I'd have to check in on that. To my knowledge, there's nothing that specifies any kind of like categories of usage. So like, for instance, if you register a potato, it's not like it goes into streams of like processing and table stock or anything like that. It just kind of is a registered variety for use as seed potato.
Yeah, I feel like personally, when I think about it, I'd like there to be more room to kind of put some of the unique traits of potatoes in registration. And it may not happen there. It may be more at the process of licensing or selling it, that's where there's a place to really highlight some of the special characteristics of the varieties. But I do think it would be good, like, especially when you have all this careful selection that's gone into it, to retain some of that information as it moves forward through the system. We have another question from Jennifer Sanders. I had a lot of trouble with what I think is a yellow potato virus this year. I have one that was very resistant, but most were not. Is this common? I'm wondering if Dwayne would have the best feedback for that.
I could try to answer that. Viruses are a major problem with potatoes, and they're often transmitted by aphids or leafhoppers or some other insect, or by physical touching of the potatoes. They're transferred from one plant to another, and then they're maintained in the seed. So you can get an entire seed lot infected with a virus, and they're extremely difficult to get rid of. They often have a profound effect in causing reduced vigor, very poor quality tubers, and so on. So viruses are a real problem. There are some varieties that are more resistant than others, but in the commercial potato side of it, they try to prevent infection in the first place by growing potatoes in an environment where the aphids and leafhoppers are very rare. So in the north, that's why they grow the virus-free potatoes in New Liskeard and try to keep the aphids from transmitting diseases to them. Seed growers have a big problem, but most of it is taken care of with insecticides and so on. Unfortunately, it's a real problem for organic farmers. But once you have a variety that gets infected, there's almost nothing you can do about it unless you want to take it through tissue culture and go that route. So that's why resistant varieties are really important, because they're the ones that will hold up against the virus for a number of years. And we're trying to identify them and use them for breeding. So if you've got something, Jennifer, I'd like to know about it.
Thanks, Dwayne.
Yes, thank you. And I do have one. There was one that was notably better than all the others, including a number of the commercial ones. So I will contact you.
Okay, that's great. We'll see what we can do with it. While I'm here, I have a technical question for Christy. On your page 14, where you've got the listing versus the registration comparisons, you have that there's a yearly registration fee of $104.24 for a registered variety.
That's right.
I was in a virtual meeting with Mark Forehand from CFIA about a week ago, and he was adamant, at least for field crops, there is no yearly registration fee. Once it's registered forever. Now, the fact that this is the same cost as the certification fee makes me a little suspicious that maybe it just got put into the wrong category.
That could very well be. It could be. It could be. I mean, I've seen that figure a number of times on the CFIA resource pages, and I've double checked that one in my cost accounting, but that doesn't mean that errors don't happen on the website basis too. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to triple check that one.
So I know for certification, there's definitely a fee because there's an inspection involved. But for registration, Mark was saying, once it's registered forever. They don't have to do another thing, and they don't care what you do with it after that.
Oh, okay.
So
well, that's interesting.
Just,
I mean, if Mark says it, he's the authority. So
yeah, we weren't speaking specifically about potatoes.
Okay, so maybe it's just for grains or something.
Could be an exception, but it was field crops. You definitely said there is no annual fee for registration. Once you've got that certificate to put on the wall, you're good to go.
Well, that'd be fantastic if there wasn't one.
Yes, sir.
Is anyone considering in the future registering or listing a variety? It's probably hard to say at this point.
it's a lot of things to weigh, right? I think the great thing is that you've got all the information in one place, and then like we can very much, be available for follow-up. Christy's available, I'm available, and we'll try to find ways that we can help facilitate the processes that people want to follow.
Mhm.
Certainly the garden variety listing is getting much more interesting, and it looks like it's sort of a foot in the door, or a place to start, or a gateway drug, so to speak. And it looks like it's fairly straightforward. So thank you for outlining that. And depending on the results of Helen's tests and AAFC, there's one or two that I might like to pursue.
Mhm.
And then we can see what happens. Find out what the real roadblocks are.
It would be really neat to test drive a variety through that system, because it's apparently an underutilized one. Peter Volney of the potato section was actually quite happy that we were looking into it, because it's something that he feels could be used more often.
Yeah, I think the test drive is a good idea, and we can maybe kind of do it in concert with the rest of you, and literally see how it goes step by step, and maybe get some good potatoes through.
So if there aren't any more, it's like time for one more question if someone has one, but we're getting pretty close to the time. So I might just reiterate that like we are currently doing testing for total glycoalkaloids at Laval University. So everyone's had received some communications about that, but if for whatever reason one of you didn't quite make it in, please contact me right away, and I'll see about like adding a few samples into that. Otherwise, I might just say thank you everyone for joining. Thanks Christy and Dwayne for the great presentations, and just stay in touch. We're here, and we really this is an ongoing process. We really want to guide you through it as best we can. Even though it's very complicated. So just, please stay in touch. Please refer to the guide as needed. And have a great rest of your day, everybody.